So Larry will talk to us about the world of ground control. Perhaps in the past, as land surveyors, you've been hired to position and perhaps monument ground control points as contractor. But now it's your responsibility to decide where these points go and how many do you need to obtain the desired accuracy and geometric strength. These are not easy decisions, and the result of your flight and the ensuing map product will depend on it. Larry will talk to us about his experience and the valuable lesson he has learned establishing ground control points. Larry, the audience is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, thanks for attending this session. My name is Larry Fox. I'm the VP of Marketing and Business Development here at BadElf. Just to give you a little bit of backstory of why this particular topic was so interesting to me, kind of goes by a sordid path. I started probably 3.5 years or so back, just getting my biennial flight review. I'm a private pilot, been a pilot since 96 or so. And I found out that getting a Part 107 after you've gotten your BFR is actually quite easy. So I studied for that, took the test, and as part of that, the FAA actually does that for free. So that was a really nice add-on. And with that newly minted in my pocket, I said, well, then I must have to go out and buy a drone because, I can't just have a certificate and not have a drone. And the thought of working with drone technology was always interesting to me because of the very nature of having been in the GNSS space for so many years. I wondered, how these technologies could converge. I was very interested in the high-end drones, but with the proliferation of the DJIs and similar drones, I was very curious about what it is that I could do with one of these, kind of thinking of it from a greenfield perspective. And, in line with, what we're talking about today with democratization, I was keenly interested in what could I do for sub $1,000? What could I share with the community? Because one of the things that I'm very interested in is education. So I guest lecture at ASU and other colleges. I'm very interested in sharing information I learn. And so this was really an excellent opportunity for me to kind of take a scientific approach to learning about what it takes to fly a drone, produce quality orthometrics, possibly have a little bit of fun along the way, which I did. But most importantly, as I mentioned, taking that scientific approach, I wanted to learn what I knew. I wanted to learn what I didn't know. And I wanted to make sure any of the products that I produced weren't misrepresented. In the data industry, it's very easy to say, I have an ortho photo and it's great. Look how beautiful it is. But my first discoveries with flying a drone were I could produce great ortho photos, but they had very little to do with the ground. And so that's where the ground control piece kind of came into play. So moving on to the next slide here. So here's a little bit of the overview of what I'll be talking about today. It's going to be a bit of a broad brush, and I heard a great word spoke earlier in one of the other presentations about the intangibles. I think the benefit that I hope to bring today is to talk about a lot of the intangibles, because the whole process of preparing, capturing data, selecting drones, working with different GNSS receivers, and producing an output product, you could have a many-day session on that. So I'm going to focus primarily on the ground control and GNSS side of the fence of that, and share with you a little of the learning I've kind of got along the way. Mind you, I did actually look into RTK-capable UAVs while I was doing this as an alternate form of orthorectifying imagery, and I find it to be a really interesting industry. There were a number of concerns that came to play with me, with wondering about the concepts of what happens with a moving photographic element. Where is the point captured in reference to what the video is actually capturing? And I'm not going to necessarily speak to that, but just as a point of reference, it's something to definitely think about if you're looking at RTK-capable drones.
Larry, can I ask you a quick question? When
Sure.
you look at RTK, you're using it to reduce the number of ground control points, right? Not necessarily to eliminate.
Absolutely not. So the primary reason, which I'll be talking about in using an RTK-capable receiver to capture the actual ground control versus doing it from the air, is the ground control that I capture is non-moving. It's going to be still in that image. So the accuracy of what I capture will always be, permanently ingrained with that imagery, at least, if you look at it from the survey level, at least for that moment in time. We can't, we have to manage things like, time displacement and all that. But with an RTK receiver in a drone, you have an imagery device in the air that's taking a picture while it's moving. So there is shift in the imagery. So depending on the type of imagery or the type of imaging device that you have, some are scanning devices and some could, dump their frame all at once. And that seriously changes the results of what you get with the accuracy associated with any particular image.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. So one of the things that comes up very, very commonly and has come up for years is the accuracy of base map data. And this is just a classic example, what you're seeing here. The traditional base map data that we get with Google Earth is, or any of the other standard imagery products is only really good to a couple of meters. And both professionals that I work with and students alike would ask the question, I've got this great high accuracy receiver and I went out and collected data and I'm standing over the fire hydrant or various other asset and it doesn't line up on the map. And I said, well, do you know that the map might not actually line up with the world? And so this was further emphasis as to why I really wanted to understand this concept of ground control and orthorectification, because if we really want to be able to demonstrate visually a photo that represents a space on the Earth, it ought to match to the Earth and the data that we collect on the Earth. So moving on. I'll give you a little bit of a clue as to where I went with how I did my testing. And so my UAV is that little Phantom sitting over there in the corner with its standard camera. It's a Phantom 3 Pro. One of the things I will discuss is battery capability. Thankfully, they're getting better now. When it came to GNSS hardware, obviously we used our own hardware, but I actually started out with just an L1 only GNSS device, which was our GNSS surveyor. And my goal with that is to see if I could come up with a really neat post-processing technique to really advance its capabilities, beyond the 1 meter that it actually produced. And I actually published a paper on that and presented it at the Esri IMF a couple years back. So that's available online. As far as software goes, I've used both Pix4D and Drone to Map. Drone to Map just kind of rides on the top of Pix4D. For collection software, I used Microsurvey or AppGloss or Collector, depending upon what it is that I wanted as far as being able to capture the checkpoints and GCP that I saw in the field. We have our own internal BadElf apps as well, which help just manipulate the device. A couple of things that I found really interesting in looking at a number of the mission planning devices. The Pix4D app is really nice. I like that because it has a number of interesting data collection modes for automating the flight. The Maps Made Easy is actually a very inexpensive flight management software. And the thing that I enjoyed about it the most is because my batteries are only lasting 15, 17 minutes at best. That gives me roughly about 18 acres at max that I could cover at about 170 feet altitude. I would have to change batteries frequently. And what I'd find is I'd get a lot of erroneous pictures as the drone was flying back and going back out to its restore point. The Maps Made Easy software actually does a great job at managing all the battery changes, flying the drone back, and not having a whole bunch of pictures that I need to edit out of all my data from wondering, oh, is this picture part of something that was actually the flight or not? So this is my setup. So when it comes to flight planning, I'm just going to go into this very briefly, but I treat flight planning the same way that I would if I'm flying an airplane. I am very intense about making sure I'm aware of everything that I'm going to do. Because the reality is when you go out into the field, if you're not prepared when you're out there, the chances that you're going to have all the pieces or information that you need are going to be slim to none. So I always spend the day before understanding, practicing in my head, looking at an aerial survey, trying to understand how am I going to approach this site, what constraints might I have around the site, where am I going to place my ground control. I actually use my mapping software or tools to create guide points as to where I'm going to put this ground control. So I could walk out in the field and go, I saw this on the aerial image. This is where I'm going to place the ground control. Obviously, safety is a big concern. Thinking about myself and others around me. Are there any obstructions that I need to be aware of? And I think it's come up here enough that Part 107 is important. Whether or not this is a Part 107 flight or not, I treat it as such and I behave as such. So every part of Part 107 compliance exists, whether this is a professional job or me just doing this to create some educational material. Now, as we move throughout the rest of the presentation, I'm really going to go over a lot of the purpose and issues associated with ground control. And really what I want to talk about is coverage, layout, and home point selection. So back in the section where I was talking about flight parameters and thinking about environment, where am I going to set up my vehicle? Where am I going to launch my drone from? I could actually pre-make the whole entire flight plan before I'm out there. And yes, there's been times when I've had to adjust that, but each one of these points is very critical as we think about how we're preparing for that site. And moving to the next slide. So here's an example site that I was actually mentioning. It's about 18 acres that we covered. And all this information was placed in a map well before I got out there. I saw a parking lot. I saw a perfect place to put the home point, which is in that lower right-hand corner. I set out targets. I always like to cover the corners of my my area. So this is a rectangular area. I definitely like to have at least one point in the middle. Now, given that this is an 18-acre spread, I find that 5 to 6 points, as they're set out right now, are really sufficient for most processing engines. If this were wider or taller, I would have put more around the edges. The one thing to consider that I find most critical as we're doing flight planning is thinking about that ground sample distance, thinking about the overlap, and most importantly, planning so that the ground control will have at least 6 to 10 images that are covered by the flight path. So in one of my big lessons learned, that has been the most critical, because I find that the processing engines can actually get a good deal of warpage on the edges if they don't have enough images covered. So if any one of those ones around the corner weren't covered well, I might have a serious problem with the result of my imagery. You'll see some warpage as you start moving away from the good points with lots of coverage to the edges. There are a number of thoughts on rules when it comes to distance, and I've heard mentioned the ASPRS. That's a good source of information. There's a colleague that I have in town. His name is Jim Kroom. He writes a number of books on drone data capture and his thought process on ground control points and setting up checkpoints and distances and the layout. And it's a really, really awesome resource for collecting data. Now, one of the things that I started evolving in with regard to ground control is, instead of just looking at things from an XY level, I started starting to consider the Z component. So as you can see over there on the right, there's a lot more consideration if you want high accuracy Z data, where you must think about pole offsets. You need to think about antenna reference points. There's a lot more at stake when you consider the Z portion of your data. So here are the four processing techniques using a GNSS receiver that I have fielded myself, and I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about all of these. So if you're looking for mapping grade accuracy, SBAS is actually quite fine. So using something like our 1 meter receiver, or even a high accuracy receiver that has no external correction source but has SBAS, will get you anywhere in the 30 centimeters, even with the most traditional of recreational GPS receivers, you'll get to 3 meters. Now, if that's good enough for you, that's fine. I find that my DJI drone roughly does in the 3 to 5 meter realm accurately. With a better receiver, which I prefer placing over ground control targets, the 30 to 60 centimeter is a lot more practical. And that's good for mapping grade, nice imagery that you would put on a web map. If you're looking at higher accuracy, though, the three elements below that are the techniques that we can go into a little bit further. So RTK, having a capability of 1 to 2 centimeters, post-processed GNSS data also with a capability of 1 to 2 centimeters, and Lband corrections with that 4 to 10 centimeter kind of realm. What I've observed in the field is GPS accuracy is typically on the vertical about 1.5, worst case about 2x the horizontal. So whatever you're statistically getting out of the real-time post-processed or Lband, you could expect 1.5 to 2x that on the vertical. So moving on. So RTK, this steps us up a little bit in the hardware cost. And so I'll be very honest with you, you don't get into RTK very cheaply. It starts probably at a minimum of $2,500 and goes all the way up into $10,000 to $20,000, depending upon the level of hardware you use. Couple of things to be aware of when you're out in the field. You're going to need some form of internet connection, whether you're talking to a CORS or a VRS. that internet connection is going to be really important. So if you're out in the middle of the woods, there are other ways to do this, but the most practical, especially in the urban areas, is to make sure you have some form of mechanism to do internet connectivity. As long as you're within 25 or so kilometers of a good base station, you should be able to achieve reasonably 1 to 2 centimeters accuracy. The big thing to be aware of is, as I mentioned previously, we're using SBAS, which is based upon its coordinate system and its projection. When you move into an RTK world, you're likely going to move into a different data source. So for example, here, most commonly in the United States, it would be a NAD83 data source. In other countries, it's going to be, their common data source. So that's one thing that, as I speak with students and I educate about this, we need to be very, very cognizant in all the recording of our data of what data source that imagery came from, what data source the ground control comes from, because a lot of times these are interchanged simply because people don't know that your datum has switched. Post-processed is an older technique of recording data. It tends to be highly reliable, generally takes 15 minutes to a point, which is very slow. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's highly reliable. You could capture 15, 20 minutes on each point and post-process that with a service like Opus or one of the other software packages, depending upon your country, for example. What this is actually doing is recording the raw measurements from the GNSS receiver. GNSS receiver has to be very, very still. I think you might have seen in the picture of before, if you want high accuracy, you need to be on a pole, on a tripod or a bipod, firmly mounted with good measurements from your ground control up to your antenna reference point. The device and the measurements are only going to be as good as how still that particular receiver is. And this is standard survey technique. So, land surveyors are going to be very, very comfortable with this particular technique, and it will produce good results. The lessons I've learned from this is there are some things to be aware of. This particular technique is, you can get away with 15 minutes. But there are times when satellite orientation isn't really ideal. For example, you have satellites that are very close to the horizon, or a lot of satellites above, and you might lose lock for a particular amount of time and find that during that 15-minute period, you were in a bad orientation of the constellation. And you'll come back and try and process the data, and it won't process. Simply because there's too many cycle slips, there's satellites popping off the horizon, popping into the horizon with lower quality. So just one thing to be aware of, if you're comfortable with the concept of post-processing and a survey style workflow, be aware that it's a very time-consuming process to do it meticulously. So now we can move on to L-band corrections. So L-band is another set of satellites that covers roughly 75 north to south. So you could see the countries that would be covered. It's pretty much most of the land mass of the world, short of places like Alaska and northern Canada. It's another service for providing corrections that we've used for establishing ground control. It's quoted at 4 centimeter. That's an RMS value. It's really more of an 8 to 10 centimeter accuracy. But for remote regions where there's literally no other way to capture and process with post-process data, this is another viable option. We've seen folks in extremely remote countries use this as a means to establish very good ground control. Now, mind you, the ground control's only going to be to the level of accuracy that you're attaining with Lband, but barring any other correction source, this provides some really good data. The challenge with Lband corrections is the convergence time. Before you get a good position, you're looking at 15 to 20 minutes over the first point. And moving between points, you have to be extremely sensitive to the orientation of the receiver, primarily because if you lose lock with those satellites, your recovery time is going to be that 15 to 20 minutes again before you get to the next point and are able to record that. One thing to be aware of, once again, this has a different reference frame. So this is ITRF08, much like SBAS is. So another datum shift. So think about the imagery captured and what datum that's in versus your ground control. So this is processing imagery in a nutshell. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go through the whole entire processing steps. Fundamentally, it comes down to processing your data looks like this. It's loading data, it's loading your ground control data, it's assigning the ground control points. So you could see you have to physically go through and mark where your ground control is and associate it with the images. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in the vertical. So understanding the geoid model that you want to apply to the data and any projections that need to be applied to the data. So I need to be aware when I'm doing this ground control that there might be a projection associated with my imagery and a projection associated with my ground control. The output product that you're going to get is going to be only as good as the information you enter into it. As we validate all this ground control and results, there's a number of tools built into most of these software packages, which we're going to cover on the next slide here, or one of the next slides. The second bullet here is really the one that I wanted to kind of go over the most, which is how does just taking a visual look at the data. One of the things that I've seen in all these processing systems is I would enter ground control data and the data would process, it would produce an orthometric result. So I'd have this ortho photo, and then I'd go look at my ground control as it lined up on the actual targets. And sometimes I would find that I wouldn't actually get all that accurate of data, which led me to understand that, hey, there's more to this than that. There's understanding your image sensor. There's understanding which images I chose as part of the ground control and what were the processing parameters that I use. So it's not a set it or forget it as you process data. You really have to evaluate the output result, because just because I put in this really good ground control that I might have had with a 1 centimeter RTK type device doesn't mean that the orthophoto is actually going to match the ground control. There's a lot of other parameters to go into it. So a visual assessment after the fact is really, really important. And this is going to lead to back to the first bullet, which is if for some reason I had things in the wrong projection, they're going to be very, very apparent in the output result. So a couple of the tools that I mentioned that are available are the processing report. The processing report really gives you a lot of insight into what the output looks like. It'll tell you how many GCPs it actually used, the RMS error that exists in there. It will give you all the parameters of how it tied everything together. You'll get the visual representation. Does this look like my map? There's some interesting artifacts that you could see in the map on the lower left, the ortho photo. And this is something I'm going to talk about in a later slide, and it has to do a lot with planning how you're setting up your imager. And I did this on purpose so that you would actually see that as you're flying a flight path, this is over 15 minutes, but all these images are almost of all different colors and shapes. Well, not in shapes, but definitely colors. And that's because I purposely left the imager in a state where it would just do whatever it wanted. And you could see that it produces a lot of bad color effects. So here's a visual example of something where if you're not planning or doing something to actively set your imager, you can get some pretty funky results. If you look at the image on the right, you'll see an actual ground control target, and yet I marked the image with a ground control perfectly in the center. It's off ever so slightly. So these are the errors that are introduced in the processing engine, and these are quite visual as we assess the results. Here's one of the most common errors that exist in ground control. Could have perfectly marked ground control, but you'll get the common question: why is all my data about 1.5 meters apart? And this is the common NAD83 WGS84 problem that I've probably answered more questions than I can imagine on. Here's another common example of a ground control point being marked in one place, the actual target being captured in a different photographic datum, and the two not being aligned in the processing image. So these are obvious errors that can be corrected, but need to be thought about as we're processing our imagery. And these are the things that ground control are really going to help with. This ortho imagery is only as good if we're saying we're correcting it with the aerial ground control and a high accuracy GNSS as the alignment of all the projected datums. Here's another interesting artifact. This is using the ellipsoid information from a GNSS receiver compared to the orthometric height. So if you recall earlier, I mentioned specifying a geoid is very important. GNSS receivers produce a number of outputs, but primarily they're going to produce an ellipsoid output with a corresponding EGM96 value of geoid. So as you're looking at the data that comes out of a GNSS receiver, the MSL that it might quote to you is really based purely upon just the ellipsoid that the GNSS is measuring, plus a very, very coarse geoid. The reality is you need to subtract out all the parts and apply a real geoid model for the area that you're capturing, plus considering, the pole heights or any attachments and antenna reference points to really pull that data up to ground level. Had I simply, this was done on purpose in order to demonstrate a point, but the wrong geoid model was applied to ellipsoidal data, and you could see that the point cloud is now well below the Earth. So things to consider as you're processing data. This is another one if you want high accuracy vertical data. If you want a pretty picture, you don't have to think about this because all you care about is X and Y. But if you really want something that maps to the Earth's surface, these are extremely important things to consider.
Larry?
Yes.
Let me ask you a question. It took me 5 years of spherical mathematics to get my geodesy license, and I'm looking at all these values that you're mentioning, and it's exactly this is what I went to university for. My understanding is that the software today allows you to do this without having to go to university for half a decade.
So the answer is yes, it does. But that's, as I mentioned in my very first slide, it's you need to know what you don't know. And, for those those who are new to doing orthophotos, the Z component of data is not very well thought out. Or it's something that we're not familiar, especially as you move into the GIS space. The Z component is really, really not well thought out. It's starting to become a bigger component as CAD and GIS are getting more and more integrated. The point being is the information is all there. So when you capture off of a low-end GNSS receiver that's just producing NMEA data, or even a high-end GNSS receiver, the data is always there. But it's a matter of telling the processing engine and understanding what the processing engine is doing, because it is truly mathematical. So you're very aware of the formula that I have over here.
Yeah, 25 terms like this big. I mean, we used to
Yes.
do it with a calculator. But what I'm saying is, in software, all you need to do is be aware of what system am I using, and be consistent, using it on every process, on everything that you do. Otherwise, you're going to get the 1.5 meters and the wall of houses, right?
Exactly. So your projection is going to affect your XY representation of that data. Your vertical datum is going to affect how it lines up with the Earth. There are some fabulous geoid models out there, and most, all the software that I've used support that. But it starts with, as I'm ingesting the ground control data, I need to pick the right field.
Right.
So if it's ellipsoidal data coming off of a GNSS, I need to know that this is starting out from the GNSS and ellipsoidal. I've added my pole heights and my antenna reference points to offset where the GNSS actually was above the Earth. And then I apply my geoid to that point, which is the precise XY, to calculate the gravity at that particular point. And now I've got a real Earth measurement of my point cloud, my DEM, my DTM, my ortho. All those are actually correct. So know what you don't know. And so this is an example of something I said, ooh, I didn't do that. Maybe that should have been part of my process. So
I know. And I love when the error is in the meters or kilometers, because those are easy to find. I hate when this 3.5 centimeters, then you're in trouble.
Then you're in trouble. In this
I
case,
love kilometers of error. I love them.
Yeah, in this case, it's about 29 or so meters, so that's pretty obvious.
All right, I'm going to let you finish. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I'm just going to conclude, Juan, with here's a small list of all the things that have gotten me in the field. And mind you, I did a lot of these in the summer heat of Phoenix, so it's I have some really wonderful reminders of things that I did that caused me to lose a few pounds of water weight while I was out there. I mentioned earlier with the Lband corrections, and I would just advise this entirely. GNSS and orientation, not just when you're lined up on the ground control. I'm a firm believer that when you're placing a GNSS over a ground control target, that should be treated as a pristine environment. Get away from it. Make sure you consider where that particular target is. Are there trees? Are there buildings? Are there metal objects? What could be blocking visibility or creating multipath? It is so critical because, as I found out, even with my pre-planning, I might say I'm going to put a ground control target in a particular place, and I realize that I'm really obstructing the sky. And a GNSS is only as good as its sky visibility. So GNSS orientation and the location is critical. If you need to move that ground control point, move that ground control point, because it's only going to be as good, the accuracy that you're going to attain is only going to be as good as the sky visibility that you have. There is no magic bullet to make GNSS, see around trees or buildings. It can't happen. The next thing is securing ground control targets. There's nothing worse than flying, 40 acres and finding out the one in the furthest corner got flipped over because it wasn't secure. Whatever you need to do to make sure your ground control targets are secure is so important. In our area here, we get dust devils and other things that come by that will blow things around, and you'll find out that you've missed one of your targets in the first corner. Well, now you're going back out, finding that you've surveyed all your targets. You find one target's may have been blown up, and you don't know if all your imagery contains a bad target. Well, if that target's in the corner, not only are you resecuring that target, but you're reflying that whole entire site. So very, very important. And that comes into the next bullet, which is checking your data while you're on the site. Make sure you have all the ground control data. Make sure it's well recorded. Make sure you have the metadata that goes along with it, which would be the quality parameters of the GNSS, so you could make additional QA measurements on the data. Make sure you have all the ellipsoidal values. Some of the other things that were brought up in the presentations, I'm not going to go too much into, but shadows, understanding the time of day is really important. Out here it's pretty sunny and could cast some pretty significant shadows as we move, early in the morning or late at night. Those could actually cover up targets as you're flying. So be aware of that. Too low or too high. The message I have there really is I started flying everything too low. I'd fly at 100 feet because I thought more data is more better. More data is just more data. Too high, though, is another consideration. So what you saw in some of the pictures was imagery of targets that are about 1 meter square from ranges between about 170 feet and 250 feet. If you're flying upwards of 400 feet, you probably need bigger targets than I had. You want them to be visible. You want them to be high contrast. We've done tests with flying faster. Faster is not always better. As I mentioned earlier, some of the imagers on especially the lower end devices, they're scanning type imagery. So the drone is moving while it's taking the picture. So you get very, very fuzzy images. So once again, to reiterate, think about the imager that you have on there. Think about the speed that you're flying. It's better to change a few batteries and fly slower than to have a bunch of blurry pictures. I showed you that one image with all the different colors. That's because I didn't set my imager to actually be optimized for the time of day and the portrait that it was seeing on the ground. One of the things I like to do when I get out to a site is fly over my ground control and fly over a couple of other areas and actually look at the adjustments on the image to make sure I get consistent results as far as the color and the status of that particular image, so that I know that they're all going to align. So I actually create what I would call a pretty picture. Finally is high contrast targets. I've tried a number of different targets, and I have always found these black and white targets, kind of like you've seen, to be the best. For some reason, I thought I could use traffic cones or other devices in there, and they would be perfectly visible in the image. You could have a 3-foot traffic cone out in the summer heat of a very bland environment such as the Phoenix area, and you can't see it in the imagery to save your life. So understand that when you set ground control, it needs to be high contrast. It should be very divergent from the background so that you'll be able to see it when you're processing your imagery. So Juan, hopefully that was a nice broad brush of information about lessons learned in ground control. I really appreciate the time in the audience listening to my lessons learned, but hopefully it was helpful.
Wow, it was a trip memory lane for me. My Geodesy class. Thank you. It was great. We we didn't have any questions at the beginning, and now we have three very interesting. So I'm going to give you some of my closing remarks time because I think it will be better used in answering some of these than in listening to me saying thank you. We have, how does Larry feel about the change of datums coming in the very near future? Will it be worse or better? And and remember that we're constrained on time, so I know this is probably a hot topic for you. So go ahead.
So I don't believe that 2022 is going to happen. I'll say that. um,
That bad.
uh, I like the concept of where we're going. I think the vertical component really needs to be a bigger component. I think the world needs to be treated as 3D. Um, and I think there's good things happening, especially with the gravity models improving. We're going to have much better representations of the accuracy of all the data that we produce on the Earth. And I think that's really critical. So I'm a big proponent of it. I work with some of the folks in our state who are actually on the committees for the new datums. And I realize there's a lot of debate. My biggest concern really is the legacy issues. You know, how are we going to bring all the legacy data and tie it into the new data? I think there's going to be a lot of problems, and I think it's going to be exacerbated a little bit in the same things that I've been mentioning, which is all the issues with projections and datums. There's a lot of intermingling that takes place, and making sure you know what you don't know, understanding the lineage of the data. So, based upon the previous discussion you had, there was a lot of discussion. I'm not declaring any of this to be survey grade. I'm saying at least behave like a surveyor and produce the best results and know that what you've done can be defensible to some engineering level. That's important, but I'll get back to datums and projections. You have to understand and be able to at least know where the data came from. If the data doesn't have the metadata or anything associated with it that describes its lineage, as far as I'm concerned, it's good for a picture, but that's about it.
Okay. This is a rather lengthy, but let's see. How difficult is the post-processing if unique coordinate systems and datums are being used? Example, datums which are not common datums in each horizontal or vertical. I frequently need to use data which uses a project-specific coordinate system and utilize an altered nav D88 projection. Is there an easy way to translate the data, or would it be better to work from start to finish with a common system and datum, such as a state plane coordinate system and nav D88 vertical?
So the long and short answer that I prefer is the latter. I like to get something into a system because I find that most of the products that I need to produce tend to fall into one system. So the end result needs to likely fall into a system. So my preference is to get all the disparate pieces into that one common system as soon as I can, because then I know the likelihood of all the steps that I take thereafter are likely going to fall into place. Processing an orthophoto or producing a DEM or a DTM, that's a very time-consuming operation. And the processing steps that take place, or the preparation of the data beforehand and getting into the appropriate projection or datum, is actually a pretty trivial process. So
Right.
if you get it all right at the beginning, you don't want to wait 3 hours to go find out you got a bad product. And so that's my preference,
Okay.
because I've done that too many times.
Yeah, we're all done. The last one, it's if one of your targets falls down, why didn't you put a heavy rock around it? Would that affect the target?
So the answer is no, the heavy rock wouldn't affect the target. So everything on the periphery would be fine. But the one thing that I find is being truly humble in all this is to be able to say, these are mistakes I've made, and they cost me hours worth of time in the field. And it's the simplest thing to go find a big rock or use the appropriate stakes. But if we don't share these experiences with other professionals in the field who are interested in actually doing this, then shame on me. My negative knowledge should be everybody else's benefit.
Right. Okay, Larry, thank you. Thank you very much. All
You're
the
welcome.
questions were answered. It was amazing. Thank you. Appreciate it.